In this lecture, we'll look at the support functions for mmind.js. There are a few new concepts in these, but much has already been covered under the mmind.js lectures, so you should be able to understand most of these functions' code. For each, we'll introduce the new concepts, and then ask you to read the entire function for comprehension and answer a few in-lecture questions about it. So this is going to be a fairly in-lecture question-intensive session here. Let's start with the readParams function up here. And this prompts for and reads the initial parameters, like f4. It returns an object, which you may recall we referred to via params in mmind.js. You should be able to read most of this code now, since it uses things we've already explained or is highly similar to Java and C. But there are a few new things worth explaining. First of all, line 4 uses the keyword true, which is a Boolean value. Booleans are a third type, the third type, in fact, of elemental, along with number and string, the other two. The constants true and false are of Boolean type, as is the result of any relational, equality, or Boolean operation like double and or double or. The expression on line 14 down here, for instance, has Boolean type. Its result is of type Boolean. Now, perhaps the most interesting thing about JavaScript Boolean operations is that everything, not just Booleans, has a true or false value. A number, for instance, is true if it's non-zero, whether positive or negative, and it's false if it's 0. That's something that'll be familiar, by the way, to any C programmers. A string is true unless it's the empty string, and so on. Things not strictly Boolean nonetheless have true or false significance, and they are termed truthy and falsy, a sort of whimsical JS terminology there. So here's question 1. It's easiest to keep track of what's truthy and what's falsy by knowing the list of falsy values by heart, because there are only 6 of them. So look up this information. It's readily available online. What values in JS are falsy? And coming back from a pause there, the falsy values are 0, empty string, as just mentioned, undefined, null, something we will get to in a little bit, nan, and, of course, false. Anything else is truthy. Anything else will register as true in a Boolean expression. To question 2. There is a bug on line 16. I'm supposed to verify there that the params length is between 0 and 10 inclusive. And I'm using the Boolean significance of params.length to do this, but I'm doing it poorly. So what's the bug? In particular, what values of params.length would be incorrectly handled by this line? Coming back from a pause, the test bang params.length checks if params.length is 0. It'd be true if params.length were false, and therefore params.length would be 0. It would be false, that entire test, as expected, for positive params.length. But it would also be false for negative params.length. So we would get no error message for a params.length of -2, for example. Let's move on here to the split function up on line 6. It's one of the most useful of the string functions, and this one's going to be an external research question. Look up split and explain what line 6 is doing to the input returned from readline. And coming back from a pause there, split breaks a string up into smaller strings, and it breaks at instances of a separator character, like the quote that we are using in our example. The smaller strings are put into an array of strings, which is returned by split. Line 6, then, is breaking the input line into space-separated substrings and pointing param line to the resultant array. Question 4 here. What happens if we call split with a space separator on a string with sequences of blanks or spaces between non-blank words? For instance, hello space space space, this space space is a test, and so on. Let's kind of try that out on a interpreter here. Do a split on quote here. Now, that's the way this interpreter dumps an array, by the way. So we have an array of, gosh, it looks like about 15 different elements here. The commas separate each element in the array. And so there is an element here, and here, and here. What's going on? Explain the result. Coming back from a pause, split is returning an empty string to go between each pair of adjacent blanks in the string that we split up. So you get spurious extra empty string values in the returned array if you have multiple separators in a row. Now, we'll fix this problem using something called regular expressions in a later lecture. Split is not just a JavaScript concept. It originated in Perl and was so useful there that it's now found in many languages' libraries. Ruby has a similar method, for instance, as does Java in its later versions. Let's move on to question 5 here. The array object has a function, a utility function, that does the opposite of split. Do, again, a bit of external research. What is that function that's the opposite of split in array? Coming back from a pause, it's array.join. If you didn't find it, go look that up and understand it. And again, this is a function now found in many languages because it's so useful. Don't be entirely surprised if you wind up with an LMQ, by the way, on those. Be sure you understand split and join. In fact, I'd recommend that you play around with them a bit in a shell to reinforce your understanding. Okay, moving on here to our next new topic, JSON, which we've seen before, but which is being used in more detail here on lines 10 through 13. They use JSON to create and initialize an object for params in the code, assigning a reference to the resultant object into the params variable. Now, I used single quotes for the keys here, by the way, but that's just for variety. JSON doesn't require them. In code, JSON values and even keys may be determined by expressions, not constants, as we're doing here for the two values of maxchar and length. And so we come to some more external research. What is parseInt? And what difference would it make if we omitted it from line 12 and just went with param line bracket 1? Coming back from a pause, parseInt converts a string containing a numerical value into an actual number. If we drop it, then the value of property length would be something like quote 10, quote, instead of the number 10, a string containing a 10 instead of a number of value 10. Conversion from string to number is done explicitly via parseInt and its cousin parsefloat. Interestingly, though you'd expect these to be part of the string object, they're actually standalone global references. So on to question number 7 here. Assuming we do keep the parseInt, and we enter fx instead of f10, putting an x for the length, we'll get the number of characters error down here on line 17. Explain exactly why this happens, and consult the documentation of parseInt closely. Just to make it clear here, I'm going to run that. So here's an mmind program, and I'm going to do fx. Number of characters must be between 1 and 10. Why? And coming back from a pause there, if we enter x for the length, then parseInt returns nan, which becomes the value of property of the property length, params.length. And this will trigger the error message on line 17 because bang params.length, or bang nan, is true, nan being false. Okay, so let's move on to getGuess.js here, see what's going on with that. This one should be entirely understandable, provided you know that readLine returns an empty string if we hit a return with nothing on the line, which is not too surprising. So try the following in lecture questions on getGuess then. First, Here's a section from a sample run of mmind.js, and I'll duplicate that. Actually, I'll let you look at it in the transcript. You should have the transcript in parallel with the lecture. If you look at that closely, you can see that I entered a double space between A and B in my guess, and the error message I get is pretty odd. Is not a valid guess with nothing before it. Explain exactly what happened there based on the logic of getGuess, and just work through getGuess and figure out why it did this and why there's a guess is too long. And coming back from a pause there, the problem is that the split call on line 6 right here, per our earlier discussion, will produce an array of 5 strings in this case, the second of which would be an empty string because of those double blanks. And this is what's being complained about when it talks about something being not a valid guess. It's just printing the empty string before it. And the guess is also too long because there are 5 strings in the split array. So we'll get the test down here succeeding. Okay, so question number 9. What's with the while line and errors here? What's that test for? And how can I do a double ampersand on a string, and I guess it's a number, isn't it? What does the test accomplish? Again, coming back from a pause, of course, everything has a true or false value in JavaScript, so variable line will be true if it holds, or unless it holds, an empty string. So true if it's got some content. And that empty string could occur if we entered an empty line. Variable errors is true if it's non-zero. So the test is saying to continue as long as we have a non-empty line and there were at least some errors, so we need to re-enter. And there's one final new item in getGuess. This is the first function we've seen that is passed a parameter. Params up here on line 1. This parameter supplies the maxchar and the length that getGuess uses to check the input. And it works much like parameters in any other language that you're used to. But of course, there's no type. In JS, one simply lists the parameters in parentheses without types. Now, we'll refer to the parameter in the parentheses as the formal parameter in our discussions, and to the variable in the caller that is passed to the formal parameter as the actual parameter. Formal parameter, actual parameter. One passes the actual parameter to the formal parameter. Now, you may pass any actual parameter to any formal parameter, and the actual parameter is simply copied across. No type matching is needed. And question 10 then. So does passing that params reference from mmind to getGuess result in a copy of the params object? Do they each have separate copies of params? Make your best guess on this one. Coming back from a pause, no copy is made. The term reference is the key. What's copied is simply the location of the params object, and both the actual parameter in mmind and the formal parameter in getGuess point to the same object. This is actually how it works if you pass a reference in Java as well, or a pointer in C. It's really hard to get an object copied in JavaScript. You have to handwrite code to do it. Copying references is always shallow by default. You don't wind up with a duplicate of the underlying object. And that's true even when you're passing parameters. Okay, let's move on now to findMatches.js. Now, there's only a little bit of new JavaScript in here, but we'll use it to do some interesting exercises later, so you need to understand it and to answer a question or two on it. The tricky thing about doing matches in Mastermind is avoiding using the same letter twice. And I do this in a rather straightforward way by setting up 2 arrays, mmatches and gmatches, to correspond with the parameters model and guess that are being passed in, containing the arrays of strings for the model and the guess. These matches arrays contain true-false elements, one for each element of their corresponding string arrays, indicating whether each element of the string array has or has not been used. So for instance, on line 6, we check for exact matches. And if we get one, we assign true via chained assignment, And chained assignment, by the way, works the same in JavaScript as in Java or C. We assign true to show that these elements of model and guess are used. We also check matches, M matches I should say, and G matches, down here in the loop from 9 to 14, which looks for inexact matches, and we update them as needed. Now, here's question 10. Wait a second here. Isn't there a bug in all of this? Because we never actually set false into any element of M matches or G matches, and they start out empty. So how does the code, for instance, that relies on them on line 13 here work if they're never set to false? Coming back from a pause on that question. We can index the missing elements anyway, based on the array discussion from an earlier lecture, and they'll have the value undefined, which is falsy. So the code works fine. If we index by an entry of M matches that was never set to true, it'll automatically be false. And then question 11. I slipped a bug into the diagram, or into the diagram, not in the main source code, for this inexact match checking loop on lines 11 through 16. Find the bug, please, without looking at the original code. And coming back from a pause there, G matches bracket I right here should have been G matches bracket J instead.